and then you hear the explosion. And that was the first shell that fell. And it was literally, we were in the backyard, the shell fell in the front yard. So it was so close to us, literally a few meters away. And, you feel the ground shaking beneath your feet. You see the crater that it leaves behind. Your ears are ringing. There's debris and dust everywhere. No one needs to explain what these things are. To run. So we just ran back over the wall, and we hid under a pickup truck that was attached to the back of a tractor, as if that would protect us. We had been living in a war for over 2 years, and we had experienced so many awful things by that point. And coming to Newcastle in July, it was sunny, it was beautiful. We were actually housed in a refugee centre in Gosforth. But what I try and do is I try and personalise, as I said, humanise. I try and tell the story from Bosnia. I try to learn lessons from Bosnia through my own experience. So it's not about looking at the wider picture. It's not about the politics. It's not so much about the context. It's about using my story, a child's experience of war. And through that, I try and educate about the dangers of prejudice, of racism, of discrimination. I try and educate about what peace is, about how we can build peace, how we can maintain peace, how we can work towards peace.
I started off Sparks Unboxed to share stories of ordinary people, if you want to call it, to educate, inspire, and to spark the mind for change. So today I have Smajo Beso on my show. He's a survivor of the genocide in Bosnia. He has seen the worst and the best of humanity. Smajo and family members found refuge and safety in the UK, and I'm proud to say in Newcastle, and we've embraced him as a Geordie. He was awarded an OBE for services to genocide education and commemoration in the 2023 New Year's Honours List, and last month was at Buckingham Palace to receive this. And this was primarily because of the work that he's done through the charity that he set up, the Bosnian Genocide Educational Trust. So today I want to share his story, spotlight his work, and share some of his key messages. So Smajo, welcome to the podcast. It's really such an honor to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me and giving me an opportunity to speak to you. And just one little correction. It's actually, yes, the work through the Bosnian Genocide Educational Trust, but also Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, who I do a lot of work with. They're a wonderful London-based organisation, and obviously they look to educate and commemorate the Holocaust, but also the subsequent genocides, Bosnia, Rwanda, Cambodia, and so on. So it's a lot of the work that I do through them, and they actually nominated me for the OBE as well.
Yeah, amazing. So it's wide ranging beyond just my understanding of the trust. That's really fantastic. So we can start with your story as a youngster, and what was going through your life at that time, what was happening in 1993, and your journey to Newcastle, just to set some context for our listeners.
Well, my family actually arrived in Newcastle on the 19th of July, 1994. So next year is the 30th anniversary. But actually, it was my dad who arrived before us on the 19th of January, 1994. So in a couple of weeks, it'll be the 30th anniversary of him arriving here. And he actually came here as part of a British government program called the Bosnia. It was set up in less than 48 hours of the first plane load of Bosnians arriving. And I've made contact with the people that set up the project. One of the workers on the project, it was actually her husband who set the program up. She found me, I think maybe a year and a half ago, and she sent me this letter because she had actually inputted the names of me and my family to bring us here. And, I think those stories about Bosnia and how we arrived are so important. So, yes, I speak about the Bosnian genocide and what happened in Bosnia and the war and how Bosnian Muslims like myself were targeted. But I also speak about our journey to the UK because I think, especially with everything happening in the world at the moment, there are so many negative and awful things happening, especially when it comes to refugees and migrants and asylum seekers, how much they're dehumanized in Western media, European media, UK media. But we're a positive story, and we're proof of what can be achieved when we support refugees in the right way. So the project was set up. My dad was in a concentration camp, um, and as part of this program, he was brought here. And then as part of that, we joined 7 months later. But actually, my story, or my journey to the UK began, 2 or 3 years before that. So I was born in Bosnia, or in southern Bosnia, in the Herzegovina region, because it's Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's the full title of the country. And Bosnia was one of the six republics of Yugoslavia, and it was by far the most diverse culturally. It had a mix of people. It was predominantly Muslim or Bosnia, but it had Catholics, Orthodox Christians, it had a large Jewish community, and various other groups as well. And I was born in 1985, so about 7, 8 months or something like that after the Winter Olympics. And I always reference Torval and Dean becoming the highest scoring figure skaters of all time, and that was in Sarajevo. And they became household names because of those Olympics. And then maybe like 7 years after that, Bosnia became the scene of the biggest atrocities in European soil, and the only instance of genocide since the Holocaust. And childhood in Bosnia was, it was incredible. It was amazing. Um, we weren't raised to differentiate between people's ethnicity or religion or skin color. My family is predominantly Muslim, but we also had Catholics and we also had Orthodox Christians in my family as well. And it's not this romanticized remembering of what a wonderful society we had. It genuinely was that, where people um,
Something
respected each other's
diverse.
differences. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
diverse, and it wasn't. I always make the point when people say we're all the same. Actually, in Bosnia we weren't all the same, but it's okay that we weren't the same. We actually value those differences. We recognize those differences, and that's a true multicultural society for me. When we actually say no, we're not all the same, but actually we value and we recognize those differences, and we genuinely had that in Bosnia. So we had this wonderful, wonderful society, but then fascists actually wanted to target that. So it wasn't just Muslims that was targeted in Bosnia. It was this shared and multicultural Bosnia, this beautiful country, this beautiful society that actually became a target as well. So yeah, my journey to the UK actually began, in 91 or 92. And we eventually arrived in Newcastle in July of 1994.
Yeah. And what was life like when you first arrived here? What was the experience
Um,
there?
it was, we had been living in a war for over 2 years, and we had experienced so many awful, awful things by that point. And coming to Newcastle in July, it was sunny, it was beautiful. We were actually housed in a refugee centre in Gosforth, just off Gosforth High Street. So, the shock from coming from a war zone, and we were actually living, or we had been ethnically cleansed by Croat nationalists to a town called Mostar. Mostar is a town in southern Bosnia famous for an old bridge, old Ottoman bridge. And we had been living under siege there, this vicious, awful siege, because Mostar was surrounded by
Mm.
the Bosnian Croat and the Croat army on one side and the Bosnian Serb army on the other side. And, 70-80% of the city centre was destroyed. So coming from that context to Newcastle, to Gosford, was incredible. And hearing, birds singing for the first time in years was actually, it was absolutely amazing.
Oh, I just can't imagine what you kind of went through in your family, um, and the kind of trauma that would have caused it. It's I was people say there's kind of culture shock when you go to another country or you move to another country and things like that. But this is kind of something different altogether. What was that kind of experience like? What was going through your head leaving your homeland?
I mean, like, I'm sure you've heard this said before, but no one no one decides to leave their home unless they really have to. And it's so easy to think when we see people fleeing, when we see people running away, or when we see people, crossing the channel on small boats, that, this is their entire life. But, Bosnia was a normal, modern European country, and we had everything that we have here. Before we started, you was speaking about going to the cinema. We had all of that in Bosnia. We had cinema, theatres, libraries, football. We had everything that we have here. And it's so easy to think, and we can be so complacent thinking that, war and violence, it's something that happens to someone else, somewhere else. But in reality, what happened in Bosnia, what's happening in Ukraine now, what's happening in other parts of the world can very easily happen here. So you go from having this completely normal, idyllic life that lived in the countryside. I had all my cousins there, my friends there. Childhood was absolutely amazing, and then that changes overnight. You wake up one day and you haven't got electricity anymore. You can't run downstairs to the fridge to grab a snack. You can't put the TV on. So your life is turned upside down very, very quickly. And then, even as a child, you kind of start learning about these things. No one really has to sit you down to explain what war and violence is. You understand these things. And for me, I saw the signs of war because my parents were trying to shield me and my siblings from what was happening. Maybe even as early as 89 or early 1990, there was a lot of tension. There was a lot of talks. Serb nationalists like Milosevic, if you've heard of Slobodan Milosevic, started coming into power a few years earlier. And, there was this nationalist, hateful rhetoric and dehumanization of Muslims. And, I wasn't aware of that because I was like, 5, 6, 7 years old at the time. But obviously my parents knew, and they had that context, and they're constantly trying to shield us and protect us from what was happening. But one of my earliest memories was, I remember we had just moved into a new home that my parents, had built, and they had been working on it for several years. And maybe we had been living in it for about 6 months before the war started. So we had moved in maybe late 91, early 92. And I was playing outside. I was with my friends and my brother. We ran into the house, or I ran into the house to grab a drink. And my mom was sitting and she was watching TV and she was crying. And I ran up to her because you don't want to see your parent upset or your mom crying. And I asked her what was wrong, and she said, it was nothing. Don't worry. And I remember she hugged me and she kissed me on the head and she said, "Go outside and play. Don't worry." And again, being a child, I was 6, 7 at that time. I went out, and really it was years later that I realized actually she was seeing war already spreading across parts of Yugoslavia and Bosnia at the time, maybe northern Bosnia would have been. And she knew she was completely helpless. There was nothing she could do. Maybe 6 months or a year before that, my parents actually could have gone to France. They could have gone to Paris. My uncle, my dad's brother lived in Paris, and I think already by that point for about 15, 20 years. But why leave Bosnia when, I described what an incredible society we have. They had just moved into their new home. But again, that's that complacency, thinking that war, violence, and the things that we see on TV now, whether they're happening in Gaza, whether they're happening in Ukraine and so on, that they can't happen to us. And, whenever someone asks me, what can we do to safeguard what we have here? For me, it's that, it's acceptance. It's accepting what happened in Bosnia, what happened during the Second World War can happen now. So, your life is turned upside down literally overnight. And as I said, no one needs to sit you down. You just start absorbing and noticing these things. You start seeing the adults around you having discussions and there's debates. I'd go to bed at night, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, and there'd still be people sitting in my living room, and my parents would be awake, and there'd be discussions, and I'd hear these things, war and guns and international community and so on. So you start piecing these things together. So before the first bullets and bombs and shells started falling, before the first soldiers arrived, I already had a sense of what was happening. I already had a sense that something wasn't right. And then us kids, war starts polluting every aspect of your life. So us kids, we started playing games of war. And I remember, there was like 30 or 40 kids living in my village, and we'd all be having this huge war game that would go on for days. We would literally, play the whole day, and everyone would be involved, and then we'd leave, and next day we'd carry on. And these are all signs. My grandma, I remember, would always say, these are signs when people start discussing politics and war to this extent, when kids start playing with guns, when kids start playing with soldiers, these are all signs of something not being right in society. And for me, that's incredibly telling.
Yeah. So before kind of, I guess the war broke out, this fear was being created and kind of seeping into our society, and as you were saying, yeah, even to the kids. And it's, how do you even, when this kind of stuff is happening, everything goes out the window, right? In terms of thinking about your future, and of course your parents would have been just worried day and night about how to keep you safe. So as a parent as well, just thinking about that and going through that would just, I don't know what I would kind of do in that situation. And you were saying there was an option to go to Paris, but how do you leave like your homeland? Imagine that's just so difficult to do. That's if that's something that you've grew up there, that's all you've ever known. People don't, as we've seen across the world over time, over the ages, people don't want to leave, just get up and leave and be forced to go. So that must have been so difficult for your parents, and the choices that they had to make.
Well, I actually think it's, in terms of what you said at the start, yes, my parents were focused on shielding us from what was happening there, just focusing on protecting us. My parents were younger than I am now, three little kids. But also, you don't give up on the things that you value in life, and you actually hold on to those things even more. And for me, that's often the misconception of refugees or people living in wars, that you are just focused on surviving. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's actually opposite. For a lot of people, yes, you've got the sort of basic needs of survival, but actually your future is just as important, or even more important than it was before. And you need good imagination to be able to imagine a better and more compelling future. And I think that's what my parents and my family have always been good at doing, helping us imagine a better future. And that's a key survival skill. So yes, my parents were, concentrating on shielding us and protecting us. But when the first bombs started falling on our village, again, there's only um, there's a limited amount to how much your parents can shield and protect you. So in the spring of 1992, our town was surrounded or our village was surrounded um, by Bosnian Serb forces. And we had soldiers all around us. Some families had already escaped. There was bombs falling. One of the first days that I heard, or that I experienced an explosion by, it was me, my brother, and one of our cousins, and we were playing. And our next door neighbor had chickens, and they had already escaped, and they had chickens in their back garden that they had just kind of let loose, because they couldn't obviously take the chickens with them. And me, my brother, and our cousin, we thought, actually, okay, when our parents are not looking, because they're distracted with getting things organized and ready in case we have to escape, in case we have to run. So we waited for the opportunity. We were playing outside, and we ran over to our neighbors, jumped over the wall, and we were chasing these chickens to see, if they could fly. We were kind of throwing them in the air, trying to catch them. We couldn't really catch them. And then we heard this whistling noise, and it was this incredibly loud whistling noise, and it's all around you. You're not sure what it is. I hadn't heard that before, and it's whistling really loud, and it's getting louder, and then it just stops, and then there's silence, and it's only a few seconds of silence, and we're kind of looking around us. The chickens are running away even more frantically now, and we're thinking, what is happening? And then you hear the explosion, and that was the first shell that fell, and it was literally, we were in the backyard, the shell fell in the front yard. So it was so close to us, literally a few meters away, and you feel the ground shaking beneath your feet. You see the crater that it leaves behind. Your ears are ringing. There's debris and dust everywhere. No one needs to explain what what these things are, to run. So we just ran back over the wall, and we hid under a pickup truck that was attached to the back of a tractor, as if that would protect us. So we knew it was something dangerous. We knew, like when we felt the ground shaking beneath our feet, we knew to run. But again, we were so naive. We were kids. As I said, I was 7 at that point. Um, we thought, that would protect us. And then my mom eventually came and took us into the house. And initially, the Serb soldiers that were, there, this was all local Serbs that my parents knew, that my parents, worked with. These were, some were close family friends. And initially things, were relatively good, although we were surrounded. No one really harmed anyone. Um, we had Serbian friends that risked their lives to bring us food, to bring us oil, to bring us things that we needed to survive. These people were still coming over for tea and coffee nearly every single day, but the only difference this time was they were coming over in uniform. So it was this surreal thing, it was still, Bosnia is a very social country, and um, people socialized, drink coffee together. And, it was still those settings, but it was surreal. These people would be coming with guns. And, I used to see a gun on TV. And me and my brother, being little boys, we wanted to be soldiers, and they'd let us play with their guns. As a 7-year-old, I held a real Kalashnikov, as an example, so it was surreal, but then things started changing as the war went on. There wasn't social media back then, so information traveled in different ways. We started hearing rumors that, Serb nationalists and warlords were in neighboring towns that were killing everybody. Things started happening. The local Serbs started being moved, and soldiers started coming from elsewhere. One of my dad's cousins, it was on the end of May, would have been 1992. He was taken away, um, because Serb soldiers were coming to our houses, more often by that point, searching for weapons and so on. So they took him away to interrogate him. No one really knows exactly what happened, but he was brought back and he passed away a few days after that. And I think he passed away was on 31st of May, 1992. I think it was a couple of days after that. I was ill. My dad took me to the local hospital. On the way back, roadblocks were set up by Serbian soldiers, and at the first roadblock, they told my dad he can't go back into the village. And my dad was like, my wife is there, my kids are there, my son was ill, I have to go back. And this, Serbian commander was saying, no chance, you have to go. I've been ordered to send everyone to a camp which was set up on the outskirts of my hometown. And my dad was, pleading with these soldiers, and I was lying on the back seat. My dad told me to keep my head down. And by chance, one of my dad's um, friends who was in the Serbian army, or the Bosnian Serb army, he was nearby, heard what was happening. He came out and he actually took us through the roadblocks, and he saved us that day. But again, things, after that, after my dad's cousin passed away, things changed, and we basically escaped through the mountains after, I think, being surrounded for about 2 months. The shelling was getting more intense, fighting was getting nearer to us, and we had to escape, through the mountains, through a dry riverbed, and we escaped to the neighboring town. So Stolac is the town, or kind of the municipal area, and my village was as part of that town called Barani. Um, in the first 9 months of war, we moved 14 times. And again, you don't have a choice. You just, my parents would have done anything to keep us safe. And again, this is what people don't understand when they have these all deterrence policies like Rwanda. When you're trying to get your family to safety, there is nothing that you wouldn't do. You're a parent yourself. You know that you would do anything for your kids. That's why these cruel deterrence policies do not work. What the Italian and Greek coast guards are doing, towing boats out into the sea and leaving them, even if that filters back to where refugees are coming from, they'll still risk their lives, because what they are leaving behind is worse than that. So cruel deterrence policies don't work. So my parents would have done absolutely anything. And most of the times we moved, we didn't know where we were going. We didn't know what we would find. We didn't know if where we were going would be worse. And there was on many occasions when we moved and we actually found something far worse. But we had to keep moving. They had to keep moving to survive. So the first 9 months of war were the most difficult. The shock, all the things that we take for granted now, everything gone overnight. My childhood was completely changed. And again, as I get older, I reflect more on my parents' experience and how difficult it must have been for them, with three young kids. How do you ensure that you have food or enough food every single day to survive? And how creative, and again, this is where imagination is so important, how creative they must have been just to ensure that we had food and water every single day. So we moved, and we eventually settled on the outskirts of Stolac. And we lived there with my dad's brother, with my uncle, for about a year until August of 1993. So by that point, my dad, had become, my dad worked in a factory before the war. He wasn't a soldier, but he became a soldier, and he was in the local army, and he was fighting alongside his Croat friends against what they perceived to be the common enemy, which was the Bosnian Serb army. First, it was the Yugoslav National Army that eventually became the Bosnian Serb army. Um, and again, life in that period was difficult, but there were still times when there would be quiet days without shooting and shelling, and again we'd be outside and playing. The only difference now was that every single game was about war. Every single game was about violence and tanks and soldiers. And me and my brother, same as all the other kids at that point, we were fascinated by guns and bullets. And me and my brother could literally look at a look at a bullet, any bullet, and we could tell you which gun it came from. We could look at shrapnel, and like that was our childhood. That was completely normal. And then by spring of 1993, so a year after we had initially become refugees, um, there was tension, and there was things happening again. My parents were shielding me from this, but the Bosnian Croats, or the Croats this time, started rounding up Bosnian Muslim. So first, it was notable figures, whether it was politicians, poets, authors, notable figures, people that could somehow organize a resistance. Again, this is, these are common strategies, and we've seen them employed everywhere. So that was in the spring of 1992. And then on the 1st of July, unknowingly, I actually witnessed my dad being taken away. It was We were playing by one of the roads, and we saw trucks leaving the center of town, and when we ran and waving at soldiers, and I knew something was happening, but I wasn't, I was too young to fully piece everything together. And again, I didn't have that context. And we see soldiers, and we're waving frantically. In my head, I'm thinking these soldiers are going on some secret mission. It's something exciting. And then my sister, who was older than me, I see her mood quickly change. And she starts saying, "We need to go home, we need to go home, we need to go home." Waving. One of my friends sees his uncle. My sister sees our dad. Um, and we go home, and we realize later that day, or I realized later that day, that my dad and all the other men and boys were taken away. The youngest was 13 in my hometown. The oldest was 90, I think. Camps were set up. Schools, hospitals, army barracks were set up as concentration camps. Um, there was also a camp set up for women and children. So these were camps set up by Bosnian Croats in support of, with support of Croatia. So there was camps in modern Europe set up, concentration camps set up for women and children. But we were lucky. We were allowed to stay in my uncle's home. My uncle that we were staying with, he um, he was in the army as well, but I think he was on leave at that point because he had injured his back, or he had some health issues. And I remember the day, it was the 2nd of July, so a day after my dad was taken, Croatian soldiers came to take my uncle away. And I remember my mum telling him, run, go somewhere. And he's like, where am I going to go? Like, I can barely walk. And I remember me, my brother and sister, we just wrapped ourselves around him, and we're screaming. And my sister screaming at the top of her lungs, "You take my dad, please don't take my uncle. You take my dad, please don't take my uncle." and they just took him away. So literally all of my male relatives were gone. You know, that they were, I think it's probably the only instance where, where soldiers were taken into concentration camps by their own army, you know. So my dad, as I said, all my cousins, uncles were taken away. My dad was taken to a camp called Bretel, which was known as the camp of death, as were my other uncles. A hospital which was called the Bone Hospital, or it was known as the Bone Hospital before the war, in the centre of town. Several of my cousins and uncles were there. One of my cousins was 17. He was kept in the basement with other kids. Um, and for several days, he would hear beating and screaming and cries. Two of his cousins died in his arms, and he and the other kids in that basement had to bury them in the hospital yards. I think it was on the fourth day when his name was called and he was walking through the corridor of the hospital. He thought, that was it. His time was up. And he walked into this room, and as he opened the door, he saw his closest neighbors sitting at this desk. And he said he smiled because he thought that they had come to save him. And these were his parents, age. And they ended up beating him, and they did the most inhumane things to him. Now that cousin still lives in Stolats. He returned to Stolats, but he's, still living amongst those same neighbors. Those people that committed these awful atrocities are still there.
Probably. So did you say children, burying children? Did I mishear that? Sorry.
So my cousin, who was 17 at the time, he was kept in the basement with other kids. So that hospital now is a ruin. Effectively, it's still there in Stolats.
Yeah.
The Bosnian Muslims, or the local population there, has tried to convert it into a educational center, commemorative center, memorial center. But in southern Bosnia, Bosnian Croat nationalists are still in power. And I'm sure we'll discuss the Dayton Peace Agreement later on. But it's the same fascists that committed these atrocities. In many cases, it's the same individuals. So they actually prevent local Muslims from doing anything with the building. So it still remains an empty shell. But you can go inside and you can see Croat fascist iconography. And during the 90s, Croat fascists used a lot of the similar iconography that Croat fascists used in the 1940s, because Croatia, the independent state of Croatia as it was a puppet state for the Nazis during the Second World War. So it's the same individuals. In Mostar, when we were ethnically cleansed from Stolats, we stayed in Mostar, which we'll discuss in a bit. Mostar still has names after Nazis from the Second World War, from fascists. And these things happen in Europe. So my cousin was kept in the basement with other kids. He buried two of his cousins, but I can't remember if they were kids or not. So please don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
But they still, he said
even
he
if they
held one
were
of his cousins. Yeah.
burying your cousins,
Yeah, he held. I remember when he described. So when I've been writing my book for the last couple of years, so me and my friend who brought the book with me, Emmeline Pierce, when we went to Bosnia in 2019, it was 2020, and we went to this hospital, and my cousin took us around, and he, took us to the room where he was held. These dark little rooms, and he explained how he held his cousins when his cousin took his last breath. He showed us the room where he was tortured and beaten, and he showed us how he was forced to stand against the wall as they beat him, and as he fell to the ground, and he would be unconscious, that would wake him up, and so on. And Bosnia is one huge crime scene, and these things, I find it incredible when European leaders say we defeated fascism in the 1940s. No, we didn't defeat fascism in the 1940s. Or when European leaders describe Ukraine as the first war on European soil since the Second World War, again, it's like such ignorance. And it's like, I always ask myself, why is that? And I think more and more, as I understand the context, Islamophobia has played a huge part in that. I think there are still a lot of people in Europe that struggle with the fact that the Bosnian Muslims, Bosniak Muslims, were the good side in this, were the side that didn't commit genocide, that didn't have official policies of ethnic cleansing and mass murder and rape, whereas Bosnian Serbs and Serbs of Bosnian Croats and Croats did. And when you look at reports and international reports, whether it's by politicians or journalists, it was always it was always the Serbian side, the Croatian side, and the Muslim side. So our religion, our faith was always used to describe us. But the perpetrators were never described by their religious affiliation. So why was that? There was no Muslim side. It was the Bosnian government side, which happened to be predominantly Muslim. But then why not be consistent and say Bosnian Serbs or Serbs are Orthodox Christian or Croats were Catholic? And I always make the point, I highlight that hypocrisy and the double standard, but actually, Croats and Serbs did use religion to justify the murder and rape of Muslims. But I always make the point, they are as representative of Christians as ISIS is of Muslims. I know what Christianity is. I know a lot about Christianity because I've read about Christianity, and I know real Christians, and I know Serbs and Croats that use the Bible to justify the murder and rape of my family have nothing to do with Christianity. But what I'm saying is we need to be consistent. And so for example, something that I was writing about on social media, there were some Bosnian Serb soldiers that were convicted for crimes and rape against Bosnian Muslims just a couple of weeks ago. But it's always Bosnian Serb soldier, Bosnian Serb policeman, Bosnian Serb soldier, policeman. It's always the individual. And what that allows is other white Christian Europeans to distance themselves from that. So why can't we apply the same standards when it comes to Muslims? When it comes to Muslims, I mean, we know the hypocrisy around that. And again, I'm not saying that we should label Serbs and Croats as Christian extremists, but they utilize religion. They utilize religion to justify these awful things. And Serbs were openly saying, or Serb nationalists were openly saying that they were defending white Christian Europe. There was European politicians that said what was happening in Bosnia, and this is written in Bill Clinton's memoirs. You can find this. There was some, I think it was French officials that were saying what was happening in Bosnia was nothing but a painful but realistic restoration of a Christian Europe. And again, for me, I do a lot of interfaith work. Religion is incredibly important to me. Faith is important to me. Faith helped us to get through the war. But again, I know the difference between a real Christian and a real Muslim from, fascists, from terrorists, from extremists. And that Islamophobia didn't help Muslims in the 90s because the Serbs and Croats continuously presented us as extremists, wanting to set up this Muslim state in the heart of Europe. And that undoubtedly had an impact. And again, they're trying to do the same now. They're trying to constantly present us as these extremists. The Croatian secret police or secret service was caught planting weapons in mosques in Bosnia in the last few years. The Croatian president has openly and continuously, various presidents continuously to speak about extremists in Bosnia, whereas the Croatian government openly celebrates fascists from the Second World War. Openly has religious iconography in government institutions, commemorations. But we don't see that. So why it's again, for me, it's we need to be consistent with this. That inconsistency sometimes frustrates me.
It's the same story, isn't it, across other parts of the world with those labels. This Muslim person, everywhere that happens is that kind of one brushstroke, and everyone's the same. There's extremists in every part of the world,
of course,
whatever religion. It is shocking that people don't know about it. I was ignorant of a few different things. Like Bosnian War, I didn't know about it until about kind of 10 years ago. But I was well into my 20s by then. So unless it's, I think there's there's two things to it. Is I guess media does play a part in it and what they're reporting, etc. And then education side of it as well. If you don't know about it, you don't know about it. And even like as a youngster, when or teenage years, I was ignorant of Palestine-Israel conflict, what was happening with that. I did not have a clue, and I was there was a Palestinian girl in my class, and just ignorantly I was saying things like, "Oh, I thought this was this," or "I thought this was that." Then once you educate yourself properly, now years later, I told my wife about it. I was thinking, I can't believe the stuff that I was saying back then. I think that's a key thing is also seeking out education and get the truth. That's what is happening out there. And it's you said Ukraine-Russia war is the first war since World War II in Europe. Obviously, of course, it wasn't. So it's one key message for me is people need to go out there and do some reading, finding out what is really happening out there. One of the things you said was you moved 14 times, which is mind-boggling. Was that within Bosnia? How did you? What was your journey to the UK? How did you get to the UK?
No, I think just to go, because I don't know whether I worded the last bit because it's such a sensitive thing. I just want to kind of revisit that, if that's okay.
Oh, of course, of course.
When it comes to Bosnia, the victims were always identified by their faith. Yeah, so we were always the Muslim side, and then the perpetrators, you had Croats and you had Serbs. The perception of what was happening in Bosnia. So, this goes to your next question about education and so on. So there was this perception that the Balkans were these lands with ancient hatreds, where people hated each other and killed each other for years, which was completely untrue. How I described Bosnia at the start was entirely like that. As I said, it's not this romanticized remembering. It was genuinely like that. I bought a book just a couple of weeks ago about southeastern Europe, where in one of the parts it was, even for a backward country like Bosnia, the sun shines. And honestly, I was gobsmacked. And then I carried on reading, and it was all about ancient hatreds, tribalism, people killing each other. And that misconception of what Bosnia was didn't help us in the 90s. And then Serb and Croat nationalists, fascists, utilized that. They utilized those views to help justify what they were doing. They utilized some Islamophobic views to help justify what they were doing. So Serb nationalists openly spoke about defending Christian Europe, being defenders of Christian Europe. Croat nationalists, for example, still speak about being defenders of European values. Whereas the Bosnian side, which was predominantly Muslim, but not entirely, because there was a lot of Catholics, there was a lot of Orthodox Christians, there was Jews, there were atheists, of course, that stayed on the Bosnian government side. So international media and politicians and how the war was presented, how it was perceived, didn't help us then, and it didn't help us now. And some people still struggle with the fact that Bosnian Muslims, or the Muslim so-called side, didn't commit genocide, didn't commit these awful atrocities. That the only side that didn't have official policies of mass murder and rape and ethnic cleansing and genocide and so on was the Muslim side. The only mosques, churches, synagogues that survived were in the so-called Muslim areas. Up to 60,000 young girls and women were raped, and they're predominantly raped by Serb and Croat fascists, nationalists. So there are people in Europe that still struggle with that. Now some people talk about a slow European or world or international response to what was happening in Bosnia. But actually, Bosnia was placed under international sanctions in 1991. Those sanctions were lifted in 1996. So it's not just that the international community and Europe watched on as we were killed and raped and incarcerated in, the biggest network of concentration camps since the Holocaust. The international community prevented us from defending ourselves. And the UK was part of those sanctions. I had an interesting, discussion a couple of months ago with a guy in the bus. Me and my brother were speaking, and we were speaking in Bosnian, and he kind of interrupted us and said, where are you guys from, and all this, and what are you, why are you still here? Why aren't you in Bosnia? And actually, we had a good discussion, but I'm not sure he got it. But I explained to him, actually, I'm here because one, I was brought here by the British government, and two, actually, my country was placed under international sanctions, which prevented us from defending ourselves, which meant my dad and all my other male relatives were taken to straight camps, which meant several family members were killed or raped and so on. Maybe if it wasn't for those sanctions, well, maybe I wouldn't have been here. And, we all have a responsibility. And for me, whoever was a part of those sanctions was actually complicit in what happened in Bosnia. That's my opinion. If you prevent one side from getting weapons and medication, then actually it's not this slow response, and it's not, you are interfering. And we must take an active role in society to understand what is being done by our governments across the world. So the Muslims were always, or the Bosnian government, sorry, was always presented as the Muslim side. So faith, our religion, was always used to identify us, but the perpetrators were never identified by their religious affiliation. And I'm not saying that we should, and I don't want to do that. But it's important to highlight that Serb and Croat nationalists, fascists, used religion to justify the murder and rape of Bosnian Muslims. And religion is an incredibly wonderful thing. And I think faith has such a huge part to play when it comes to healing, but we also must be consistent. So again, as I said, religion was used to identify the victims, but why not use religion to identify the perpetrators? And if you look at the definition of a religious extremist, then Serbs and Croats, nationalists, are very much religious extremists. So, and again, if you compare that to conflicts where Muslims are involved or terrorist attacks and so on, again, religion always plays the most important part. And again, this is where I think education plays a big part, which is why a lot of people in Europe, including this country, don't think that, or think that only Muslims can be terrorists. People, and I've seen this on social media. I mean, they haven't got a clue what was done in Bosnia by extremists, by fascists. As I said, who openly said they were defending white Christian Europe. It was done in their name. But again, if we are consistent, when we identify Serbian and Croat perpetrators of war crimes, we say Bosnian Serb soldier, Bosnian Serb policeman, Bosnian Serb wartime soldier. It's always the individual, and that allows this distancing. That allows normal white Europeans, Christians to say, hang on a second, this has nothing to do with me. This allows normal Serbs and Croats to say, hey, this has nothing to do with me. But we don't afford the same opportunity to Muslims. And why is that? And again, I personally think there's still a lot of Islamophobia there. People struggle accepting that the only genocide that was committed on European soil since the Second World War was against Muslims. It was by people who utilized, who manipulated Christianity. As I said, I know what Christianity is, and they're as representative of Christianity as ISIS is of Muslims. This isn't Christianity, you know? But again, it's that consistency, and that would help with a lot of the debates that we are having in this country at the moment, whether it's about refugees, whether it's about Muslims, whether it's about minorities, and that context is important, and education is important. So the work that we do is, or that I do, is about personalizing and humanizing history, is about putting a face to the statistics. There's no better way learning about genocide and murder and rape and refugees than actually hearing from the people that experienced it firsthand. And actually, when you learn about 60,000 women that were raped in Bosnia, that's a huge, staggering number. But actually, when you learn that one story, when you learn, for example, I got a book the other day, and let me just try and find it up here. If we just pause there, because it's a really good book. Let me just try and find it.
Yeah, go for it.
Great book. It's called Our Bodies, Their Battlefield: What War Does to Women. one of the stories from here is from Bosnia, and I managed to only read a bit of it before I had to stop. But again, when you read that one story, you understand why that statistic of 60,000 is so incredibly important. So that's what I try and do. I try and humanize stories. I try and personalize stories. I try and explain that, behind all of those statistics and figures, behind, the people being killed, the numbers of people being killed in Ukraine and Gaza now, these are kids, these are women, these are mothers, these are brothers, these are fathers, people with dreams, people with a past, people with hopes for the future. And for me, there's no better way of teaching about genocide, so teaching about what happened in Bosnia. But again, the work that I do is not just about Bosnia. It's about us here in the UK. It's about learning what happened in Bosnia. It's about, taking the stories there, looking at, how wonderful a country was, this multicultural, multi-ethnic country, and then how things quickly changed. And it started with the humanizing language. It started well before 1990, before the war in the 1990s. By the time the war started in the 1990s, for years we had already been hearing Serb and Croat nationalists, particularly Serb nationalists, talking about Muslims, in such a derogatory way, equating them to disease and vermin and so on. And I always make the point, what are you doing when you are eradicating disease from society? You're doing society a service. So it became completely normal to kill and rape. And that's what in this book, that's what the story is about. People killed and raped, their friends. I've got Bosnian friends in Newcastle. One of my best friends in Newcastle, his dad lost three brothers. His mom lost two brothers. They were taken away by their best friends, people that they grew up with. So how does that happen in society? And again, we're so quick to say that war and rape and genocide are perpetrated by monsters, by these awful people. Actually, I don't like to describe them as monsters. They became monsters, but actually they were just ordinary, normal people like me and you. And the question must be, what happens to an individual? What happens in society to lead someone to do that? Because it's so easy to imagine that it's, monsters coming from a different country, these awful people, wanting to take what is ours, wanting to destroy what is ours, speaking different language, carrying, flags of a foreign country and so on. It's easier to imagine that than to imagine, one of your work colleagues wanting to kill you just because of your name, because of your faith, because of your identity. But that's what happened in Bosnia. So how could that happen? How could it happen that, in some cases it was even family turned against family? How does that actually happen to society? So the work that I do is not just about Bosnia, it's about us here in the UK. It's about preventing what happened in Bosnia here or anywhere else for that matter. But it's learning from that. It's about safeguarding. It's about building peace, because I always make the point, peace isn't just the absence of war. Peace is far more than that. And we need to think about peace in a different way. Peace isn't just a given. What is peace? Peace has to be more than just the absence of war. And I don't think we spend enough time talking about peace. And when we, whichever event it is, when we commemorate genocide, when we commemorate war, when we do events about Islamophobia, when we do events about refugees and so on, I think there should always be a discussion about peace and what peace actually is.
The luxury of peace, of what we have in the UK, because it is a luxury. If you go by the numbers, everything that's happening in the world, it's millions and millions of people that are suffering and going through that. Thank you so much for sharing. And I 100% agree. I think what you're saying about connecting with people and seeing just that one human story and change your mind, or create that awareness of what exactly people have been going through. Um, 9 times out of 10, or 10 times out of 10, if somebody who does not understand what's happening in Palestine, or what the people are going through in Palestine or in Bosnia or elsewhere, they just sat down and chatted one on one, 100% understand it. I think we're too disconnected as a society over here from being connected with others and what they're going through. And
I think
I was. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
no, Karen.
I was just going to say, I've over the last couple of years, over the last 10 years, I've been to a Holocaust memorial, um, like a museum in Washington, D.C., and talked through accounts of what people had gone through, and families and children and things like that, and that had more impact than kind of anything that you see on TV, etc. I also went to kind of the same trip 7 years ago. I went to the 9/11 memorial, Ground Zero, it's still called, and it had this bit where you're going through. It had pictures of the family. It was displaying the lives of the victims and their families and things like that. Both accounts, I came out in tears. You can't. How can you not? How can you not go through that and understand on a personal level, not be moved by it and not connect with other humans and what they've gone through? You empathize with that as well. And people need to go. I think people need to go through that. They need to understand it's that education bit, but also really feeling what happened. I think a lot of society is just disconnected. Again, I say that they're not understanding or feeling what a fellow human being is going through. I was doing some work on the Syrian border, visiting some camps and that, and even though I had not gone through any of that, but I had kind of absorbed sitting with families and listening to their stories. I felt like I had absorbed just a percentage of the suffering that they went through. I came back from that experience months and months, a bit like I wasn't myself, thinking about what had gone on. Um, what was going to ask next? So let's chat about your the work that you've been doing with your trust, and you've touched on already on the work it has been doing and the objectives. But it'll be great to I want to kind of raise awareness a bit about what you've been doing. I think you launched it in, was it 2020?
Yeah.
Trust. Please tell me about why you set it up, what's the objectives, and the things that you've been doing.
Well, just before I tell you about the trust, I'd just like to add,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I think you
please.
made some really great points there about being disconnected. I think just with how social media is at the moment, that we are so intent on convincing rather than listening. We are so intent on convincing each other rather than actually understanding. And I think that's such a part of the problem. Like, people are stuck in their social media bubbles. They have their ideas and they don't want to engage. And it's very difficult to have meaningful and personal conversations. And I think that's a huge part of that disconnectedness. Is a huge part of current or modern day society, how we're disconnected from each other. We struggle to empathize, we struggle to understand. I think that will get worse, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I've set up Bosnian Genocide Educational Trust. Again, it's about that humanizing, it's about making the connections, um, it's about looking at the meanings behind the statistics. It's same as what you said. You visited those two museums or memorial places, and you left with tears in your eyes. And again, that's when you really understand what the meaning of that statistic is. When you understand that actually that statistic, that number, is someone's child or mother or father or brother or sister, and the lives that they had, how they live their lives. It changes your perception of that conflict, or changes your perception of your own lives. And that's basically what I try and do. I started initially just about 8 years ago organizing events to commemorate the Bosnian genocide. So we have a small Bosnian community here in Newcastle, and we never really commemorate. And then in about, I think it was 2017, that was the first Bosnian Genocide Memorial event that we had at the City Library. And, I was in discussions with Newcastle City Council, and I think we said we were aiming for about 20 people, because the UK actually has an official Bosnian Genocide Memorial Day, which I think is absolutely is incredible. So we were aiming for about 20 people. So I was really working, for several months, trying to organize everything, trying to plan everything. We set out, I think, 50 chairs because I was like, right, I'm going to try and get, more than 20. We actually managed to have between 130 and 150 people. We started like 30, 45 minutes late by the time we got more chairs out. So it was absolutely incredible. But what I try and do is I try and personalize, as I said, humanize. I try and tell the story from Bosnia. I try to learn lessons from Bosnia through my own experience. So it's not about looking at the wider picture. It's not about the politics. It's not so much about the context. It's about using my story, a child's experience of war. Um, and through that, I try and educate about the dangers of prejudice, of racism, of discrimination. I try and educate about what peace is, about how we can build peace, how we can maintain peace, how we can work towards peace. So I use, and I have been using my story for the last 8 years. Initially started with, organizing events, and then I gradually realized actually the best way to teach about this is through sharing of my own story. And, I gradually started sharing more and more. And it's difficult. It's always difficult. Even now it's difficult, and I speak hundreds of times a year, but it's always difficult. But for me personally, it was it was more difficult not speaking, if that makes sense, because the people that committed those awful atrocities, they're still there in Bosnia. Some high-ranking officials have been convicted. Others have been convicted and released. But vast majority of the foot soldiers that killed and raped and did the most awful things, they're still living in the same communities that they once terrorized. And then what's more than that, I was seeing that hateful ideology being exported across the world. So if you remember Andris Breivik in 2011 murdering 70 or 80 people in a labor camp, he was influenced by Serbian ultranationalism. If you remember Christchurch and 52 people being killed in a mosque, that terrorist driving to the mosque was, listening to a Serbian ultranationalist song in the car. He had the names of Serbian knights from the Battle of Kosovo from 1389 on his gun. Battle of Kosovo, 1389. In 1989, so a few years before the war, Slobodan Milosevic, the Serb leader at the time, organized a march to mark the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo. And then in 1995, when the Bosnian Serbs entered the town of Srebrenica, where more than 8,000 boys and men were slaughtered in just a couple of days, he made reference to the same Battle of Kosovo from 1389, and he said time had finally come to take revenge against the Turks. So I was seeing this hateful ideology exported. I was seeing awful things happening. Vast majority of the white supremacist attacks happening in the world now have some kind of roots or connections to the Balkans in the 90s, whether it's Serb or Croat nationalism. They're heroes. They're Serb and Croat nationalists and fascists and war criminals are heroes for white supremacists, for the far right in Europe, because they have the model of how to deal with the Muslim problem. So when you have European leaders like Orban from Hungary talking about Europe's Muslim problem and how do we deal with Muslim problems, that's what they mean. That's how they want to deal with it. Viktor Orban is a huge supporter of the Bosnian Serbs and Serbia. So again, these things were happening around me, and I felt that I had to do something with my story. So I started sharing. It was difficult. There was times when I would break down. I still break down, but I felt that I had to do it. I had to use my experience to safeguard what we have here. As I said, it's more about us here in the UK than it is about Bosnia. So I started sharing, and I started sharing. I started linking up with various organizations. Holocaust Memorial Day Trust is such an incredible, incredible organization. They do the most amazing work. They have such a fantastic team. They have been so supportive and given me a platform to speak up and down the country, to speak in the House of Lords and, in Parliament, in all these incredible places to meet politicians and ministers. They've been wonderful. And then slowly, I started realizing that I had to somehow formalize the work that I do, because I work part-time at the university, and this was, all of my other work is around Bosnia is done on a voluntary basis. And I always had this idea of, writing books and recording other stories and encouraging other people to share their stories. So I set up Bosnian Genocide Educational Trust in 2020. And that's when it was registered as a charity. And again, the idea is to humanize, personalize history, to record the stories of those that came to the UK as refugees, to set up an archive to record the stories, but also to learn from those stories, to reflect on those stories through exhibitions, through books, through educational material, and so on. And I don't know what the final aim is or what the final kind of end goal is. I've been doing this for 8 years and I'm going to keep doing this because I feel like there's so much to learn from Bosnia, especially in a world where Muslims have, in Europe, where Muslims have such a bad reputation because of how we are presented in the media and so on. There's so much to learn from Bosnian Muslims. When you listen to mothers, Bosnian Muslim mothers that have lost 60 family members, they have lost sons, brothers, fathers, husbands, and they don't have an ounce of hate in them. When we listen to them courageously sharing their story, I feel like there's so much to learn from Bosnian Muslims. When we were on the brink of extinction, when the international community placed us under international sanctions, when we were surrounded on all sides, killed, bombed, starved, raped, we didn't turn to extremism. When, for the last 30 years, that same hateful ideology has remained. Bosnia was forced to sign this peace agreement, which gifted the Bosnian Serbs 49% of the country. In just a couple of weeks' time, on the 9th of January, Bosnian Serbs celebrate the creation of their entity within Bosnia called the Republika Srpska. There is no English translation of it, but essentially, if it was translated, it would mean Serb Republic. They celebrate the creation of that entity on the 9th of January, and that's commonly known as the start of the Bosnian Genocide. And this is commemorated in the heart of Europe, where you have fascist and extremist ideology, iconography, you have marches, you have songs, you have tanks and people carriers with the names of religious figures, you have bishops, you have all levels of society, you have thousands of people there. This happens in the heart of Europe. Why does this get unnoticed? Why doesn't anyone in Europe notice what is happening? Why? Same as the Bosnian Croats on the other side. Bosnian Croats celebrate war criminals. There are marches in my hometown of Stolac. Black shirts, you've heard of the black shirts, they march from the center of town, from a spiritual center, from a Catholic spiritual center or a church to, it's not a church, it's kind of like, it's owned by the Catholic Church, but it's like some kind of spiritual center. It's empty. Okay, it's the point was that it was built opposite the mosque. The town grew around the mosque. But from that point, they march through town with fascist flags, and they end with mass at the local Catholic church. Awful things happen. As I said, monuments, there's fascist flags, and why is this unnoticed? But again, Muslims on the other side, spending, genocide survivors living for the last 30 years in that context, when it could have been so easy after the war to also turn to extremism, but we haven't. And I use, again, my experience as well. So when my dad was taken away, we remained in Stolac in my uncle's house for about a month. Then, I think it was the 2nd of August 1993, we were rounded up in one of the local collection centres. And it was actually the factory where my dad had worked just before the war. And women and children were gathered there. We were searched by soldiers, our belongings taken from us. I saw my mum being searched and groped by these Croatian soldiers. My mum knew one of the soldiers. She knew, it was a friend. And they searched and grabbed her. They took her everything that we had, and my mum was forced to sign this document to say that she was given everything that we had, everything up for safekeeping to the local council. I've got that document. I've got a copy of that document with my mom's signature and hundreds or thousands of other signatures from that day. We were then loaded onto cattle trucks, driven towards Bosnian government-controlled territory. Again, as I said, we were one of the lucky families because there were families in concentration camps. Croatians had concentration camps for women and children. All of these things should be common knowledge in Europe. Why aren't they? So we were driven towards Bosnian government-controlled territory. We were forced off. and we were forced to march again to the Bosnian government-controlled areas. August in 1995, August in 1993, or August in Bosnia in general, it's incredibly hot. It's boiling. Bosnia gets like 40, 45 degrees on average in August. We didn't know where we were going. We didn't know what would happen. We had, several layers on because they couldn't, they wouldn't let us take anything with us. The only thing that we took with us was one photo album. And I've got that photo album. We brought it to the UK. We moved. We lived in ruins at times, and we eventually settled with my mom's auntie, so with my great auntie, um, on the outskirts of Mostar. So Mostar is the town that I told you famous for the old bridge I told you at the start. So we were there for about 20-ish days, and we decided to actually move to Mostar because shelling was becoming more intense. We were running out of food. So my mom thought, actually, Mostar, a bigger city, this was a little village next to Mostar. But she thought it's a city, there'll be food, there'll be water, there might be even electricity, because again, information traveled in a different way. We traveled on the back of a truck. We got to Mostar. It was like, I think someone described Mostar as hell extinguished. And that's a good way to explain it. We got there at night. There was no electricity. If anyone wants to learn about what happened in Mostar, Jeremy Boyne did a wonderful report, which is still on YouTube. It's called Mostar Unfinished Business. It was actually used as evidence in The Hague against Croat war criminals. But Mostar was surrounded. Uh, there was no food. There was no water. We got there at night. There was shelling. At one point we thought we were seen by the side of the road. We all kind of threw ourselves to the ground. And my mom had a sister. My mom's sister, Amina, lived in Mostar. So my mom, being worried what would happen to us, disorientated. We struggled through the houses, with bullets and bombs falling around us. And we managed to make our way to my Auntie Amina's house, and we stayed there for the remainder of the of our time in Bosnia before we came to the UK. My grandparents were there, my auntie, my uncle, their two kids, and life was incredibly difficult because you're surrounded on all sides. I still don't understand how my mom and my auntie managed to put food on the table for us. I just don't understand how they did. It's absolutely incredible, but they managed to find chicken feed, which they made this awful, awful brown bread, like disgusting brown bread. They started mixing it with this other powder that they found, but then it was making a skin shed. My brother took his trousers off one day and he took a lot of skin off, so we had to stop using that. So we went back to just having this awful brown bread, but that kept us going because there were other families that had nothing. There was people that would be knocking on our door begging for food. There was people dying of starvation. There's like 60 or more than 60,000 people in a very small geographic area. It's just the east side of Mostar. Bombed relentlessly. If you look at the footage and the report by Jeremy Bowen, which I think is absolutely incredible, you'll see the scale of that destruction. But again, if I go back to what you were saying a lot earlier, but even in those moments, you don't give up on the things that you value. You don't give up on the things um, that you hold dear in life. So at the height of the siege, we actually started school, and we went to school at night because it was too dangerous during the day, and we were desperate to go to school because it was a bit of normality. It was, we could get out of the house. My granddad kept telling my mom, look, they'll catch up with school, but if they lose a leg or if they die, that's something completely different, isn't it? Like you value education, but they'll catch up. But for my mom, it was important, and for my auntie, it was important. Um, and again, they kept reminding us of those values. And actually, it's such an important thing when it comes to survival, being able to imagine a better future, a more compelling future, a future without war and without violence. And my mom and my auntie were incredibly creative and incredibly good at doing that. And for me, that's leadership. Like we speak about what's happening in this country and the government that we have now and the poor leadership that we have, and in Europe as well. What my mom and my auntie were doing, for me, that's leadership. They were leading our family. The last night of school was actually on the 24th of January, 1994. So it's coming up to the 30th anniversary in a couple of weeks' time. And that night, the Croatian army actually used a truck plane to drop, homemade bombs and explosives onto Mostar. And it was unlike anything, that I had experienced up to that point. The whole school was trembling, it was shaking, not trembling, that's the wrong word, but the whole school was shaking. Um, it was unlike anything that we experienced at that point. And I remember everyone was screaming and shouting, and we would have school at night, as I said, because it was too dangerous to go during the day. And we would have these little homemade candles. You'd have a bit of oil and a shoestring, and you'd light it, and that would be your light, and you could just see basically, a little space around you. So everyone was like screaming and shouting and crying, and I was just frozen in shock. And for me, it was unlike me because I was a crier. I cried at every opportunity during the war. My brother was completely different. My brother, my brother, I don't remember him crying at all. My sister was older, so she had a completely different understanding of what was happening. So as I said, the Croatian army used a crop plane to drop bombs onto Mostar, and through the classroom window, I could see our whole street up in flames. I could see this kind of awful kind of flame, and we ran to the basement with everyone else. My mum eventually came to get us, and as we were running back up to the hill, up to my auntie Amina's house, my auntie Amina's son was running down, and we could hear him, and there was this awful just smoke and fumes and smell. They used chemicals and God knows what else. We were struggling to breathe as we were running up. So we could hear him somewhere in the distance through the smoke. He was shouting, "Mom's being hit, mom's being hit, mom's being hit." So we run back. My auntie Amina was actually at the front door. She was on the terrace of her house when the bombs were dropped. She was cut across the stomach. She was thrown back into the house. My grandparents, my sister, and my sister's kids, they put her on a blanket. They carried her out of the house. Neighbors rushed out to help. Um, they got her into the car, but petrol's like impossible to come by because of the international sanctions. Again, this goes back to that other point. Um, They managed to get her to the main road into another car which had a bit more petrol. That car ran out of petrol as well, so they had to push. And again, you have to imagine it's complete darkness. There's, thousands of shells would be falling onto Mostar daily. So there's this awful gas and fumes and smoke, and it's complete darkness, and you see explosions around you, and they get her to the hospital. Again, because of the sanctions, it wasn't the pre-war hospital. It didn't have any medical equipment. It had, they couldn't give her anything to even ease her pain. But at least they had doctors. They tried to do everything to help her. And again, if you look at the Jeremy Bowen report, he films from that same hospital, and you will see the conditions that those doctors worked in. So they tried everything, and she was so strong and she hung on. But unfortunately, the next morning, on the 25th of January 1994, she died. And in those moments when we're living under siege, January 1994, it was an incredibly harsh winter. We had snow. We were running out of firewood. We were running out of the awful chicken feed. We'd fall asleep hungry every single night. Our house was being targeted by tank shells. On one occasion alone, our house was hit by 6 tank shells, and we would all just run to the back room, and we're all holding on to each other, and you're just hoping that one of those shells isn't going to come through the wall, because everyone that you love, everyone that is still alive, is in that room with you. I hadn't seen my dad for months. All of my male relatives were taken away. The easiest and the most soothing thing to do for my mom in that moment would have been to tell us that all Croatians, that all Christians, that all Catholics are responsible, that they're all equally responsible for taking my dad, for putting us into this situation, for killing my auntie, that they're all to blame, that they're all the same, that they're all fascists, that they're all killers, murderers. But my mum realised what a defining moment this was for us. And literally on the very day that her sister was killed, my mum sat me, my brother and sister down and carefully explained that we can't live our lives with hatred and anger. We can't generalize, we can't hate, we can't think that everyone is the same. That the best way to resist those that were trying to kill us was not to become hateful and angry like them, was not to become full of full of hatred, because she always used to make the point by dehumanizing us, they've actually only managed to dehumanize themselves. And that had the most defining moment on us, because it wasn't just one conversation. And it wasn't just one conversation by my mum, it was conversations by my grandparents as well. My grandparents carried their daughter out of the house on a blanket, bleeding. And they were still able to reflect on their experience in that way. So that's why when I see people sharing awful, hateful, dehumanizing things on social media, people that have never experienced anything even a tiny bit close to that. And I always wonder if my parents, if my mom, in those difficult moments when the most soothing thing would have been to tell us the opposite, they could do it. Why can't other people? So for me, that's the key lesson from Bosnia. And my mom and my grandparents used their faith to help them to deal and process this. And if it wasn't for that moment, and if it wasn't for all those conversations that we had, I do wonder how different my life would have been. Would I still be doing this work now? What would my views be of Croatians? What would my views be of Serbs? What would my views be of Christians? What would my views be of others? And again, it's not just my mom and my grandmother that did this. So many other mothers and grandmothers throughout Bosnia did this. That's why we didn't turn to extremism during the war, and that's why we haven't and won't turn to extremism now. Even though my parents passed away, my grandparents already passed away, and they never had justice. So the person or the persons that killed my auntie, they're being protected by Bosnian Croats and the Croatian government. They're being protected. There is evidence there. Her that case was supposed to be heard in The Hague, but The Hague sent a load of cases back to Bosnia to allow the Bosnian courts and so on to deal with some of these cases. So my grandparents passed away; they never saw justice. The people that the organizations, the armies, the institutions that killed her, they're being openly celebrated. They're being openly celebrated by Bosnian Croats. They're being openly celebrated by Croatia, and Croatia is an EU member state. Brexit is such a huge debate in this country. Croatia is an EU state, and Croatia protects war criminals. Croatia honors and celebrates war criminals. And my grandparents died with that injustice, but they never for 1 second taught us to hate or generalize. And my mom and my auntie, I've got one other surviving auntie. I suspect that they won't see justice in their lives either. But for me, that's why this work, the work that I do, is a form of justice, because I'm actually speaking up and down the country, whether it's in schools, colleges, universities, House of Lords, as I said, Parliament, in front of children, in front of students, in front of politicians. And I'm not only talking about how my Auntie Amina was killed. I'm not only talking about what happened to us in Bosnia. I'm actually using my Auntie Amina story as a way of building peace here. I'm using my Auntie Amina story and the story of my mom and my grandparents and how they reflected on this as a way of building peace in this country. And I always say, if my Auntie Amina only knew that 30 years later, that someone would still be talking about her, and not just talking about her, but she'd be actually inspiring people, and I wonder what she would think about that.
The spirit of what your parents and your family did for you, for others, it's an incredible example of humanity for them to be in that kind of extreme circumstance, but still be able to keep that unity and teach the kids, yourself and your siblings, that not to turn to hatred. So it's an incredible message to share, one of peace, and violence just begets violence. Was it? I'm not sure if it was Nelson Mandela that said, darkness can't drive out darkness, only light can. I'll have to look it up afterwards if I've misquoted.
Yeah, I think it
But
was
it's,
Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King. I know which one you mean, but I don't know
yeah,
which one said it.
yeah. So it's an incredible journey that you've come on, and I think your parents and family have instilled that. You were saying leadership, instilled that in you, and I know when you came in the UK, it must have been tough to settle, and incredible stuff. Not just through the trust that you're doing or the talks, but you've also became, it's amazing to me. Also, you became a lecturer at Newcastle University, an architect as well. That's no a small thing, especially given the context. You've come over, your education disruption in a brand new country. I think that is another element of why I find your story so inspiring as well. Tell me about what you're given your OBE earlier in the year. Well deserved, for the work that you've been doing. What was it like receiving that letter through the post from the king for your work? What does it mean for you and the work that you?
I mean, in terms of kind of success or achievements, as you said, uh, I always make the point that the Bosnian community, again, is proof of what can be achieved when we support refugees in the right way. The only reason that we stayed in the Northeast is because of the help and the support that we were given in the 90s. Some of the first families that came here in the 90s were actually brought here as part of returning humanitarian convoys from Bosnia. And this link between Bosnia and the Middle East goes back to the 1980s when the miners were striking up here in 1984, 85. It was Bosnian miners that sent aid to the Northeast. And then when the war started, it was actually miners in the Northeast that organized first to send aid to Bosnia, which I think that link is absolutely incredible. That's, part of the research that I'm doing at the university is focusing on the Bosnian community. So I'm looking at the stories and what happened in Bosnia, but I'm mainly focusing on the Bosnian community to basically set up an archive of those stories of movement and migration and the help and the support that we were given. So the link goes back to the 80s. And, I've got letters from Jim Cousins, who was the MP of Newcastle at the time, where in March and April of 1994. So that was, a month or 2 or 3 after my auntie Amina was killed. My dad was already in the UK. I was still living under siege in East Mostar. As I said, my auntie had just been killed. But I've got letters from Jim Cousins, who was writing to the British government, to the Croatian government, the Bosnian government. And in those letters, he describes us as his constituents. He was trying to locate us. He was writing to the British Red Cross and International Red Cross saying, I want you to locate my constituents, which I think is absolutely incredible. So I didn't even know where Newcastle was at that time. I'm not even sure I knew where the UK was at that time. I don't know whether I could have found it on a map. I remember when we found out that my dad was being taken to the UK, I remember looking at an atlas and seeing this tiny little country, and I thought it was initially like a desert island somewhere. That was the first thing that came to my head. And I remember seeing images of the British monarchy and so on. So I was like, in my head, I had this fantasy, imagined of what this could be. But for me, again, if it wasn't for the help and the support that we were given, people campaigned to bring us here. That for me, again, that's this. If we support refugees in the right way, and now we have people that are doctors, that are nurses, that are academics, that are researchers, all wanting to contribute um, to the UK. And I always make the point when you have that support, it's very difficult to then not feel like you belong. And I feel like I belong here. The UK is my home. I still feel Bosnian, but I feel British as well. And when you have that support, it's very difficult and not to feel like you belong. But also when you have that support and when no one is pressuring you to give up your identity, well, again, then it's very difficult not to feel like you belong. So for me, my Bosnian identity is very important, and um, the Northeast is incredibly important to me, and I find it incredible, the welcome that we've been given over the years. When we were housed in the refugee centre in Gosford, next to our refugee centre lived a couple called Christina and John. They opened their homes up for us. They held parties for the kids and so on. So many incredible, amazing acts of kindness like that. And again, it's one of the reasons why I do this work today. And again, Bosnian community is proof of what can be achieved when we support refugees and those people that are coming here in the right way. So my work wouldn't be possible without that support now. We usually hold the Bosnian or the main Northeast Memorial event in Newcastle Cathedral, and I have such a wonderful relationship with the cathedral and the Council of Faiths and various other groups. The Reformed Synagogue in Gosforth, they hold a memorial service every single year. Last year, I was invited by Brenda, the president of the community there, and they made Bosnian food for me. There was a service for the victims of the genocide. I think it's incredible. We have so many wonderful things here in the Northeast, and that's one of the reasons why, again, I do this work. So when I got that letter, I genuinely thought it was someone playing a joke, because I got the email because of COVID. Usually would have got letters. Now I've got an email, and it actually went into my junk. And I noticed it, and I was like, what? I just left it. And then literally it was like, I don't know, a few days later, 10 days later, I was going through my junk and moving things around, organizing my Outlook. And I looked again and I opened it. And I was like, hang on a second, is this? And I had literally I think I had to get a response in the next day. So yeah,
You had never checked it.
Yeah, and I would have missed it. I would have missed it. So it was a bit surreal. Again, it's not about the recognition itself, but it's just the context of everything coming here, everything that my parents experienced, everything that my parents lost, everything that my family lost and experienced, and everyone else in Bosnia. And it's with that context that I look at, uh, the OBE. It's with all of that in mind, and I know it will give me more opportunities to carry on educating about about what happened in Bosnia and building peace here. So, with that in mind, it's been great, really, the last, I don't know how many months, because it has opened up so many doors, and I've met so many wonderful people that want to help, whether it's with regards to Bosnia or here in the UK.
I think that's one great thing about it. Of course, well deserved, and also it's creating that platform as well to elevate and share your message further. And as you said, opening up doors as well. And it's great. I mean, I was born and brought up in Newcastle. I know how friendly it can be and diverse, and it does make me feel proud that you came here and found sanctuary and were adopted, but not told to integrate. That can have loads of different connotations, doesn't it? And there's one certain politician who's not in the front bench anymore, famously or infamously said, what was it? Integration has failed. Community integration has failed. It already succeeded decades before they came in power. It's just people don't want to see it, or it's just pockets here and there. And you've given back thousandfold back to the city that you became a fellow Geordie. There's a few links that you referenced. So there was the documentary. I'll make sure that to put in the link for that. If people want to find out more about Trust or the Holocaust Memorial Trust, is that what it's called? What is there websites that they can go to? I know you've got a website, so I can include all that.
Yeah, so yeah, I can forward those things to you, and you can maybe put them in the description. Yeah, so it's the Jeremy Boyne report is called Mostar Unfinished Business, which was used as evidence in The Hague. Incredible report, and the work of British journalists in particular was absolutely incredible, because British journalists were amongst the first to discover the camps in certain parts of Bosnia and so on. And, there was so many there: Alan Little, Jeremy Bowen, Martin Bell, and so on. Incredible journalists. And then the Bosnian Genocide Educational Trust, we have our website, and there's information up there. There are stories, and there are different ways to get involved. We also do study trips to Bosnia and so on. So more information can be found on there. And then the other one is Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, and they also have a wonderful website with a lot of resources. And it is coming up to Holocaust Memorial Day in January. So this will be a perfect opportunity for people to check their website out and see what they can do to learn more about what happened, whether it's in Bosnia or during the Holocaust, or whether if people want to organise an event or something similar.
Oh, fantastic! So there's other ways that people can get involved. Is that information on the website on things that they can do and be more active?
Yes. So Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, they have hundreds and hundreds of resources, stories from the Holocaust, from Cambodia, from Rwanda, from Bosnia. There are lesson plans and so on. On the Bosnian Genocide Educational Trust website, again, there are different ways under education and education resources of ways people can get involved. I think one of the easiest ways is to organise, whether it's a talk or a sort of meeting or gathering at their work or school or college, university, and to invite a speaker in. So Holocaust Memorial Day can get Holocaust survivors. There's not many Holocaust survivors around that do speaking anymore, but there's John Haidu and Martin Stern, who I've had the honor of listening and hearing firsthand. And then obviously through the Bosnian Genocide Educational Trust as well, that's one of the main things that we do, organize speakers to go into various places. And again, these things, they don't have to be big events. In the past, I've done, very small talks to very small groups, and equally, I've done talks to 1,000 people. So there's different ways to engage, and there's different ways to do it, whether it's in person or online. In the past, I've done, I've done a talk for a small group of people, maybe 20 people. Then we've done something similar to the human library concept. We've done one-to-one chats and kind of discussions where people might feel a bit more comfortable asking questions when it's in smaller groups. So there's loads of different ways to engage, and there's loads out there that people can use.
I think it all counts, doesn't it? And, even if it's a small gathering, they at least they can kind of set a spark, and then they can go and speak with others as well. So what's next for you and your trust? Any significant plans that you're thinking of?
So the big plan is we are working with Newcastle City Council to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Bosnian community arriving to the northeast. And then as part of that, we will be announcing, or I'm announcing it now, a new archive project, a new research project that specifically looks at the Bosnian community, how the Bosnian community arrived here, and the contributions that we have made, recording stories, testimonies, objects that will form, books, archives, exhibitions, and so on about the community. So that's the big thing that we are doing at the moment. And a big part of that is interviewing members of the Bosnian community, which is incredibly difficult because it's incredibly raw for a lot of people. Some people, we've started interviews already, and some people have never shared their story before. So there are some amazing things happening over the next year or so, but that's the main thing. It's the archiving and the research of the Bosnian community, because no one has really done that yet.
Oh, and if people wanted to support the trust in terms of that, is it funded? Do you do fundraising, donations? If people wanted to donate, is there
So on the website there's a donate button. We don't really charge for any of the things that we do, which has obviously made it difficult to keep going because, as I said, I work part-time and then part-time and kind of funding myself. So so we have set up a donate button now, so people can donate on through the website. And yeah, so some of the things that we do is organising the annual commemorative event here in Newcastle. That's usually in July. So we usually have it at Newcastle Cathedral, so people can keep an eye out for that. And it'll be advertised on all social media and Eventbrite. We also have a flag raising ceremony outside the Newcastle Civic Centre. And again, that usually happens in July. So people can get involved, in terms of planning or just attending these events. And people can reach out to us. So if you go through the website, Bosnian Genocide Educational Trust website, people can email us and we can, have a chat meeting and we can discuss the ways that people might be able to volunteer and support us.
I'll make sure to include all of that in whether it's on the YouTube description or the show notes. Thank you so much, Smajo, for sharing such a personal account. I know you've done it quite a few times, but I'm sure it's still quite difficult to share it. It was certainly quite harrowing to hear all of it, and I've learned quite a lot, and it's really broadened my mind a bit to go out and seek out more, find out more what happened. And it's also been very inspiring as well, your personal story about, and you didn't have to do any of all of this, but you did take action, and again you're taking a leaf out of your parents with their leadership to go on and share your story, and I think it's having profound impact. You've done hundreds and hundreds of talks. That those ripples is gonna make a big impact. So yeah, once again, thank you. I'm so proud to have you on the show. Honored to have you on the show, and hopefully this can reach many more people as well. So thanks again, Smajo, and we'll speak again.
Thanks so much.